T.S. Eliot once said that there is nothing more intrinsic to being human than fearing the night. Well, he didn't say that exactly, but he meant it. These lines within Rhapsody of a Windy Night, every street lamp that I pass beats like a fatalistic drum, and 1:30, the street lamp sputtered, the street lamp muttered, the street lamp said, reflect what Eliot had felt when writing the poem, as these large, noisy, gas-powered street lamps line the Sorbonne for the first time, illuminating Paris all night long. To Eliot, the night is a time when the urban landscape empties of its life and noise. In a poem critiquing how industrialization is removing natural aspects of human life, the night being removed of its lifelessness and being illuminated is rather the natural fear within us of nighttime being forcibly removed. But if you're like me, this doesn't make any sense to you. Maybe it's the 115 years since those gas lamps went up in Paris, but the night is no longer an intrinsic fear. Why is that? What is it about dark, illuminated, empty streets or the hours where no one but you seem to be awake? This feeling, you can say, well, it's the call of the night.
You shout so cold. You've done this before. So a light I can't ignore.
The Call of the Night is an exceptional display of the psychology behind the appeal of our prized degen hours, packaged into an absolutely breathtaking 2 seasons of animation. I think one of the best romance shonen hybrids ever produced, and one of the best anime of 2025 despite its fledgling popularity. And to me, I credit it to making me discover why the night appeals to me so much, and what about it has resulted in me naturally gravitating towards working better at night or being more immersed in the content I consume, and feeling simply more relaxed and at peace. And it's these insights I wish to share today, now that I'm no longer leashed by school word limits and can leech off my university's equipment. I can talk about what I want, and this was an essay I've wanted to write for a very long time. Historically, humans have never been synchronized creatures. The biological goal of waking up at sunrise and going to sleep a bit after sunset was rarely ever historically achieved to scale. You do get that, these early chronotypes, people who can run down Manly Beach at 4 AM and not be phased at all. Same way you get people who feel strangely awake at midnight. People who become productive at 2 in the morning and somehow they're more focused than they were the entire day. Within anthropology, night owls are seen as an evolutionary trait. Logically, it's always dangerous if everyone sleeps at the same time. If an entire tribe fell asleep together, there would be nobody watching for predators or rival groups or jester maxes. Therefore, some members of the group naturally stayed awake later, or woke up earlier than everyone else, a rotating watch if you will. Pretty simple concept. Someone was always awake. The night owl might be the evolutionary descendant of the person sitting by the fire long after everyone else had gone to sleep. This concept is called sentinel hypothesis, and it is in part responsible for this appeal to night. A biological appeal within some people, and if you want to include biology, you can extend the responsibility of the appeal of night to things like insomnia or people who work night shifts getting into the habit of a changed circadian rhythm. And you would be right to base responsibility on this. The percentage of the population who say they stay up naturally quite late is probably overlapping with the percentage who get it descended down to them evolutionarily. And that's what I always thought was why I would stay up, base it off provable science, case closed, until Call of the Night. You see, what's not described in any of that science I just explained is the feeling, the strange sort of emotional gravity that nighttime seems to have. Biology can explain why some people stay awake late, but it can't explain why the night feels different. Why at 1 a.m. the same street you walked down earlier suddenly feels unfamiliar. Why messages you'd never send during the day suddenly feel completely reasonable to type out. Why people get nostalgic, why people feel lonely, why the quiet of the night feels peaceful and other times unbearably heavy. There's something about nighttime that seems to amplify emotion, but in a very subdued way. And if you've ever stayed up far too late on a consistent basis, you probably know exactly what I mean. At night, people tend to become more introspective. The constant background noise of the day disappears. The same way there seems to be no more traffic rules, there seem to be no more traffic of obligations anymore. No deadlines, no schedules, no expectations. And if there are, they feel either manageable because of the adrenaline of the deadline being linked to exactly how long you're awake, kicking your brain into a, sixth gear, something I know all too well, or it's because the world around you slows down in a way it rarely does during daylight hours. And when the world slows down, your mind finally catches up. Suddenly you're thinking about things you didn't have time to think about earlier. Conversations replay in your head, old memories can surface. You start wondering how people you haven't spoke to in years are doing. The classic thinking about an embarrassing moment from years ago, and I swear this is not just me. Night has this strange ability to make us more emotionally honest with ourselves, but it more so has a drive to wanting to be in this state. It's like the kick your body desires to become honest with itself. And maybe that honesty comes from after an entire day of thinking, moving, interacting with people, and your brain being worn down. The usual filters that keep your emotions neatly organized starting to weaken. So you combine this change in yourself with the change around you, the world becoming quieter, slower, less supervised, and that combination leads people to behave differently at night. They open up more easily, you can wander without a plan, the motive never dies.
That place was lit, man. What's the motive now? What we doing?
Yeah, real shit, What's the next endeavour?
Motive? Bro, it's 2 a.m. Let's go home.
What do you mean, let's go home, G?
And they say things they might not say during the day or sober. And that creates a strange kind of freedom, the dreamlike freedom to exist without constantly measuring yourself against expectations, like a small pocket of reality where the normal rules of life temporarily stop applying unless you're working in an Amazon warehouse. For a quiet few hours between sunset and sunrise, the world exists in a kind of suspension. And that suspended world is exactly the space that Call of the Night explores. Because the show isn't about vampires, and the angle it takes towards romance is more so about learning to love and connect than love itself, and I'll get to that. But to me, the show is about what happens when someone steps outside the rigid structure of daytime life and enters that strange, unscripted world of the night. And I think the show wants you to start looking at the night as a completely different world. To do this, you need to start with who is the type of person to answer this call. Ko. He is never presented as much of a heroic protagonist, but not your classic rom-com clueless chud either. He's just tired in an existential sense. He's a 14-year-old who, despite good grades, lost interest in school, has dwindling friendships, can't seem to fit the routines that everyone around him accept without question, so he stops going to school entirely. Not in a rebellious way, but because he simply doesn't see the point anymore. And that's a very specific choice of character. It's a slate for someone who isn't running away from anything per se, subverting the type of person you would think runs from responsibilities of the day for the freedom of the night. Rather, he's just someone quietly drifting away. During the day, everything feels structured, almost predetermined. It's a world where everyone seems to know what they're supposed to be doing. Obviously exaggerated in concept, but still ideally in line with our own logical world. But Ko doesn't understand why people care about certain things, not in a way of him lacking comprehension or factors outside of his control. It's just a simple questioning of normalcy, something most of us usually do, but also brush away just as quick, knowing there is no reason to question things that we may be powerless against or that everyone else deems correct. So when he first sneaks outside at night to just walk around, something strange happens. Just look at the auditory and visual language of this
いい気
scene.
持ちだ。初めて夜に誰にも言わず外に出た。
The camera lingers on these beautiful
Not
wide
this
shots
year,
of
but-
the city at night. Neon lights, open roads, this purple starry sky that the animators at Linden Films will soon come to master. When I first watched it, it was some of the most beautiful animation I've ever seen, in such a way that's hard to describe purely visually. And for Ko, the world feels so much bigger than the small life he thought he was trapped in. And this combined with the visuals just reignite that feeling I get when I'm walking around empty streets at night. I love this scene so much, I walked the exact street Ko does in real life. That entire suburban Saitama area just truly feels like I was in the show. Anyways, this moment is where Ko's story begins. He meets Nazuna Nanakusa. Now, on the surface, Nazuna introduces the supernatural element, vampires, and immortality, as well as the show's main focus on romance, but I will get to both of these elements later. Philosophically, Nazuna represents something much more important. She represents someone who already belongs to the night. Nazuna moves through the world with a kind of carefree confidence that Ko has never seen before. Her animation while going from building to building or even just walking around is so fluid, so at peace and lackluster in a very controlled way. Just from body language alone, you can tell this is a character that doesn't care about schedules or the normal human concern that dominate daytime life. She just lives. And yeah, she has concerns and issues the same way many of us do, and it's not like those magically go away at night or else you wouldn't have a story or characters to develop. But what she does have is a baseline carefree nature. That's her default state and personal philosophy to live by. And that fascinates Ko, because for the first time, he sees someone who exists completely outside the structure that made him feel so suffocated, which leads to essentially the point of the entire series. Ko decides he wants to become a vampire, like her, and not because of power or immortality. He wants to become a vampire because it feels like it's the only way he can permanently belong to the night. In other words, Ko doesn't want to escape reality, he just wants to keep living in a reality without the expectations of daytime. And this sounds on the surface unhealthy, but the show revolves around Ko learning to live in this escapism the night provides, while still seeing value in the day, since you can't have one without the other. And a lot of conflict emerges from wanting to live in the night and completely escape the day. This is where Call of the Night becomes really interesting, because the show constantly asks a question. Is the night actually freeing Ko, or is Ko just using it to run away from things he doesn't understand? The night in this series is portrayed as peaceful, liberating, a world where people with unusual lives or problems naturally drift together. But at the same time, the story makes a point to never fully romanticize it, because the night is also isolation. Everyone Ko meets at night might have some reason they aren't part of the daytime world. People avoiding responsibilities, Mappa animators in Shibuya Meltdown after seeing this year's release schedule, and vampires who exist completely outside human society. It's a community of people who don't quite belong anywhere else, and Ko is slowly detaching from reality and becoming one of them, which means his journey through the night isn't just about freedom, it's about something much more unfortunate, figuring out whether he's discovering himself or losing himself. And this is where the story circles back to something much closer to us, and I mean us, because most people who feel drawn to the night aren't vampires unless you're Michael O'Leary, and they're not middle school dropouts wandering empty streets in Tokyo. Mostly. They're just people who, for one reason or another, feel something different when the world goes quiet. People who feel strangely awake at midnight, people who suddenly start thinking more clearly at 2 in the morning, and people who find themselves walking outside at night just to breathe for a moment. And like Ko, it's often hard to explain exactly why. And that's the part that Call of the Night understands so well. The night can feel peaceful and liberating, but the show never pretends it's purely romantic, because the same thing that makes the night feel freeing, the absence of expectations, can become a very kind of dangerous escape. And much like more common ways to escape reality, drugs, alcohol, consuming content like you're doing right now, if there's one thing Ava taught me, it's that too much escapism equal bad. So the continual drive to find a place where responsibilities disappear is a very slippery slope where drifting away becomes easier than moving forward or fixing the very issues in the day you're trying to escape from. That's the tension at the center of the story. And watching Ko walk that line forced me to think about my own relationship with the night. It feels so comfortable and different from the day, but has it become something that I've come to rely on? And if it has, is that bad? Is challenging the natural fear of the night as catastrophic as T.S. Eliot implies it being? Well, if we step back a couple years before Eliot's time, you have Dracula as the hot new piece of literature among the horse-drawn streets within the ends of Croydon and Brixton. Long before anime and modern horror films, vampires were already deeply tied to the idea of nighttime existence. They represent people who exist outside the rhythm of ordinary life, creatures who only wake when the rest of the world sleeps. When Dracula was first published, it was a reflection of the anxieties of Victorian society, and if this next section doesn't sound as conversational as I've been being, it's because it's straight out of my Extension 1 English essay, so apologies for being lazy. The Victorian period was filled with massive cultural changes. Industrialization was transforming cities, scientific progress was challenging religious beliefs, traditional social structures were starting to shift. Gothic literature emerged partly as a response to that instability. Instead of celebrating rationality and order, Gothic stories explored fear, emotion, chaos, and the supernatural. They created worlds where the familiar structures of society began to collapse, replaced by something darker and harder to control. Vampires became one of the most powerful symbols of that shift. Dracula himself represents something that exists outside the orderly world Victorian society was trying to build. He's foreign, ancient, unpredictable, and most importantly, he belongs to the night. Nighttime in Dracula is where the normal rules stop applying. It's where Jonathan Harker realizes he's trapped inside Dracula's castle. It's where Lucy sleepwalks into the dark and becomes vulnerable to the Count's attacks. It's where the boundaries between civilization and something far older begin to blur. The night is where society loses control. And that idea is something Call of the Night inherits and completely transforms, because the vampires in Call of the Night aren't monsters lurking in castles. They're just people who live at night and happen to be always insanely attractive. Nazuna sleeps all day, wakes up after sunset, and spends her nights wandering around the city. She doesn't really participate in the structures that define normal human life, and while there are still hints later on of this being something she struggles with and has to remedy later on in her arc, the fact is that she represents a kind of existence that Ko has never seen before, a life completely disconnected from the expectations of daytime society, and that's why Ko becomes fascinated with her. But Call of the Night doesn't present vampirism as purely romantic. Just like the escapism of the night, the show treats becoming a vampire as something much more complicated and nuanced. Within the story, humans don't become vampires automatically. They only turn if you fall in love with a vampire who bites you, and that's why the show is a romance at its core between Nazuna and Ko. Historically, vampires have always been connected to ideas of intimacy, desire, and most especially vulnerability. We all know what Dracula biting someone was a metaphor for. Call of the Night takes that idea and reinterprets it in a completely different PG-ish context. Vampirism in the series becomes tied to emotional connection. If Ko wants to escape the human world and live in the night permanently, he has to do something he's never really done before, learning how to love someone, one of the very things he questioned when challenging the normalcy of the day. So vampire mythology becomes more than just a gimmick done to get those desperately needed initial manga sales. It became a very crucial choice to explore one of the show's central questions. Why are people drawn to the night in the first place? Is it because they're searching for freedom, or is it because they're searching for connection with those searching for freedom too? The more Ko spends time with Nazuna and the other characters who inhabit the nighttime world, the more complicated that question becomes. Because the night in Call of the Night isn't just full of vampires, it's full of people who don't quite fit into the daytime world. Suddenly, vampirism starts to feel less like a supernatural condition and more like a metaphor for choosing to live outside the expectations of society. A metaphor for the freedom that comes with existing in the quiet hours of the night, and Ko, standing between the human world and the vampire world, becomes the perfect character to explore that tension. Because becoming a vampire would mean fully committing to the night, and would also mean leaving the daytime world behind. And as much as that decision sits at the center of the story, well, that story only exists because of the single rule that transforms the entire premise of the show. If Ko wants to become a vampire, he has to fall in love. And if we are to be blunt and ask why love, well, the answer is much more clearer than why vampires or why Ko. It's because love is the exact opposite of escapism. Escapism is distance, love is closeness. Escapism allows you to disappear from the world, love forces you to become deeply entangled with another person. Escapism asks nothing of you but retreat. Love asks for vulnerability, patience, attention. So if the night represents the fantasy of stepping outside the structures of normal life, romance becomes the mechanism that prevents that fantasy from collapsing into pure avoidance. In other words, Kotayama builds a kind of philosophical checkpoint into the premise, and that's a very big problem for Ko, because when the story begins, Ko doesn't just reject school or social expectations, he openly questions the idea of love itself. He doesn't understand why people obsess over relationships, less so how. To him, love feels like just another strange script people follow during the day, which makes the premise of this series quite ironic. Ko wants to escape the daytime world because he feels alienated from the emotional scripts everyone else seems to follow. But the only way to escape is to learn the hardest of those scripts, that tension becomes the engine of this entire relationship between Ko and Nazuna. Because let's not forget, Nazuna, despite being the embodiment of nighttime freedom, is just as emotionally confused as Ko is. She understands the mechanisms of vampirism, she understands the rules of the night, and she wants to convert someone into a vampire desperately, but she doesn't understand romance, therefore is unable to. Their relationship starts in a strange space between friendship. Nazuna bites Ko for food, but it isn't exactly romantic in my opinion unless you have your fan service glasses on. The two of them are essentially trying to reverse engineer what love even means throughout the entire show, and that awkward uncertainty is actually one of the most honest parts of the show. A lot of romance stories, and believe me, I know, begin with characters who already understand what love is supposed to look like. They're shy about it, sure, maybe confused about their feelings, but they still understand the basic emotional framework they're working within, and I mean, why would they not? Even shows like You and I Are Polar Opposites, which is airing right now, and challenges this premise, still relies on the failure of an expectation, the awkwardness of a moment not going as both people who fell in love for the first time think it should, and then learning about each other through this failure of expectation still has that expectation and framework in place. Ko doesn't. So the relationship between him and Nazuna becomes less about conventional romantic tension and more about this slow sort of exploration. What does it mean to relate to someone? What does it mean to trust someone? What does it mean to care about someone's presence? And the night becomes the perfect environment for that kind of emotional experimentation. Because as we have discussed, the night strips away many of the social pressures that surround us, including romance. That's why some people send that 2 a.m. text that they regret the next day. In that sense, the romance in Call of the Night mirrors the atmosphere of the night itself. It's unstructured, uncertain, a little bit surreal, and more importantly, it develops slowly. Which makes sense when you remember that Ko's attraction to Nazuna initially isn't about Nazuna as a person. It's about what she represents, metaphorically the night-given human form. She's confident where he feels uncertain, carefree where he feels trapped, comfortable in a world he has only just discovered, and I don't know why I keep doing lists of threes now that I have noticed it in my script, but he's in love with the idea of what she represents, and that's an important distinction because part of growing up and part of learning what love actually is involves separating the fantasy of someone from the reality of who they are. Something a lot of romances seem to just ignore, but for me seems like a far more present issue within most real life people. This series acknowledges it so well, and as Ko spends more time with Nazuna, this fantasy starts to dissolve. He sees her laziness, her emotional immaturity, insecurities, being bullied by the baddest women in fiction, and most of all, her loneliness. Nazuna stops being an abstract symbol of freedom and starts becoming a person, and when in the show that happens, Ko has to now confront a much more difficult question. Does he want to become a vampire because he now loves Nazuna? Or does he want to become a vampire because he always just loved the night? Those two motivations are not the same. One of them is connection, the other one is escape, and that distinction is where Call of the Night becomes much more thoughtful than its premise might initially suggest. It understands that the appeal of the night often begins with the fantasy it provides, the initial drug of freedom, of solitude, of stepping outside the expectations of ordinary life. But it also understands that fantasy alone can't sustain a life. Eventually, that fantasy has to collide with real relationships with other people. Consequences of your actions exist. Half of Ko's screen time is dealing with them, and the other half is not just a love story but a test of whether the night is simply a place to escape from reality or a place where real connections can actually be built. And all this ties me back to the show's philosophy. The reason why I made this video, why I fell in love with Call of the Night, and the line that made me truly open my eyes to what I'd been doing for so long by embracing the solitude of nighttime. At one point early in the series, Nazuna says something that feels like the thesis for the entire story.
Let me help you. Why do you think people stay up all hours of the night? Because they want to watch TV, or have something they want to do, or maybe they're worried about tomorrow. It all boils down to one inevitable conclusion. Because they aren't satisfied with how they spent the day. Take a look.
It sounds dumb, but the more I sat with it, the more it starts to explain almost everything about Call of the Night and about myself. Every character in Call of the Night, even the brilliant ones I could make entire essays of their own about, like Anko, ended up in the night because something about the daytime world wasn't working for them. The night gathers all of these people together. They don't quite fit anywhere else, and that's what Call of the Night understands better than almost any story about nighttime, including Linden Film's first attempt, which to me tackles night in a much less intelligent way and could warrant a video on its own. But anyway, night isn't just a setting, it's a state of transition, a space where the structures of daytime life temporarily loosen. During the day, everything is defined. At night, those structures blur, and suddenly the world feels open, which is exactly what Ko experiences for the first time in his life. The world stops feeling like a narrow hallway and starts feeling like an open field, if you will. For the first time, Ko feels something that had been missing from his life: freedom. And I know that word's been ruined, but that freedom is intoxicating in every sense of the word. Call of the Night never treats freedom as purely romantic. It's escapism. The series constantly walks that line of escapism and its consequences. On one hand, the night gives Ko something incredibly valuable, but on the other hand, the more time he spends in that world, the more detached he becomes from everything else. Ko becoming a vampire represents the ultimate question the show is asking. What happens if you take that Call of the Night? And I know it's dumb to take this long to get here, but let's just break that question down for a second. The night feels honest to me and many others, I swear, but the show slowly complicates that idea, because while the night strips away social expectations, it can also strip away structure. That's what makes him falling in love so hard, because love functions as the counterweight to escapism. If the night represents freedom from society, love represents connection back to another person, the step away from isolation, away from the quietness of the night. It forces Ko to ask a much harder question than whether the night feels good. It forces him to ask whether the life he wants is actually meaningful. Because escaping the daytime world might feel liberating, but if you escape everything, what's left? And I don't mean everything like the Evangelion way, I mean every moment Ko spends drifting deeper into this world. Is he discovering who he really is, or is he slowly running away from the life he doesn't want to face? I haven't read the manga, so I don't know, but for the anime so far, the series never gives a simple answer, and that's part of what makes it so compelling. Because if I'm to make that answer, well, I don't know either. I used to say the night is appealing to me probably just because of genetics. I already talked about the science behind it, but the feeling was always unexplainable until I could visualize that feeling, that vibe through the call of the night. Use it as an example of what I mean: the purple skies, the neon lights, the creepy nuts soundtrack. Everything about the presentation of Call of the Night, it explores this world that I speak of. The beauty, the loneliness, the freedom, and also the danger. By the end of the story, the night stops feeling like an escape from reality. It starts feeling like something much more complicated. A mirror, a place where people confront the parts of themselves they couldn't face during the day. The people are drawn to the night when they aren't satisfied with how they spent the day. And it wasn't until I heard that line I realized what I had been doing. By desiring and only limiting my happiness and peacefulness to the time of day when I can be isolated, well, that made me reflect. I mean, dissatisfaction isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's the first sign you need that something in your life is wrong and needs to change. And Ko's nighttime wandering did begin as escapism from dissatisfaction, but over time it became something else, a search for connection. And in a strange way, the night ends up doing exactly what Ko needed. It gave him the space to figure out what kind of life he actually wants, not the life expected of him, and not the one that society pushed him towards, but his own. And I think that's why Call of the Night resonates with me, because a lot of us have felt that same strange pull toward the night. But what the show taught me is that the night doesn't fix your life, it gives you a place to think about it. Sometimes that's exactly all that is needed, but not always. For Ko, the night is a mirror, a place where he confronts who he truly is. For me, I want it to be like glass, something I can look through, something that helps me see the day a little clearer when the sun comes back up. And if you didn't understand what I just meant, well, I think I barely do either. But it feels relieving to explore something quite close to me personally through a text that has taught me a lot about it. Thank you very much for watching.